As we enter this next unit, land-based empires, I think it's important to keep in mind that until recently, a majority of the world's population had always lived in multinational and multi-ethnic empires. It was the most common form of political organization prior to our own more recent conception of the nation state. Most empires are built through violent conquest, like the Mongols, but some throughout history have been constructed through diplomacy and marriage inheritances. We aren't talking about that last kind today. In fact, today we are solidly in the violence camp. Today, we're talking about how land based empires developed and expanded in Eurasia from 1450 to 1750. The biggest technological development to come out of the Mongol era was definitely the combination of gunpowder, flamethrowers, and bells that became gunpowder weapons like cannons and firearms. These weapons unraveled centuries of traditional warfare. Walled cities no longer offered protection from cannonballs. Highly trained knights in heavy and expensive armor no longer mattered compared to any Joe Nobody with a gun. And a leader's monopoly on the production of weapons allowed them to consolidate their control over their own population and maintain that control through threat of force. This is philosophically referred to as a monopoly on violence. Gunpowder weapons allowed rulers in Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia to conquer large swaths of territory and centralize control in a monarchy or other absolutist system. Let's start in Europe. As European monarchs started to wrest power from the church after the disaster of the plague, a system of competing states drove the development of firearms technologies as each sought to be the strongest, most centralized monarchy. Without these strong monarchies, control over a bunch of people with guns was dicey at best. Soldiers needed to be drilled, artillery experts needed to be trained, and it all had to be maintained at the cost of taxpayers. Armies drove more efficient tax collection, and more efficient tax collection supported bigger armies. With these armies and these taxes, monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella could lead their people to victory over the last of the Muslims in Spain. And King Louis XIV of France would use his royal army to seize territory from the neighboring Netherlands. You could also use your gunpowder equipped army to break the power of the landed aristocracy or the nobles when they tried to rebel, like Henry VIII in England. Speaking of breaking the power of the nobles, let's move across the continent to Russia. Starting in 1480, a series of princes started to pull out of the Mongol orbit and establish their control over the region around Moscow. The most prominent of these was Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible. Ivan was big on the whole consolidation of power for himself thing. He created a secret police equipped with gunpowder weapons and sent them out to police the action of the nobles to make sure they weren't plotting against him. After establishing absolute control, the Muscovite princes started looking eastward towards Siberia, where they pushed ever farther by creating lines of protected forts and encouraging the migration of Russians further east. With the soft gold of fur the migrants and the soldiers often sent back, Russian monarchs grew ever wealthier and ever more able to build standing armies to control their own population and to threaten the states to the west of Europe and south towards the Middle East and India. Now, as we shift geographically to the south, we're going to what are more formally titled the Gunpowder Empires, or three Islamic empires that all coincidentally grew out of Turkic warrior groups from Central Asia. And I'm talking here about the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal. The Ottoman Empire is namely the most important and the longest lasting one. They emerged on the scene in the mid 1300s after the demise of the Mongols under the statesmanship of the House of Osman. After slowly gobbling up land using gunpowder weapons, particularly cannons, for a few decades throughout mostly Anatolia, in 1453 they deal a huge blow to the world of Christendom when their Sultan Mehmet II, or Mehmet the Conqueror, uses these cannons to destroy the three-layer wall that had protected the ancient city of Constantinople for 1100 years. By putting the Byzantine Empire out of its misery and conquering the heartland of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the Ottoman Turks were officially knocking on the door of Europe and would march those cannons and firearms through Greece, the Balkans, Hungary, and as far as the city of Vienna, twice. The main rival of the Ottoman Empire, however, wasn't quite the Christian states of Europe, so much as it was their neighbors to the east, the Safavid Empire. The Safavid Empire was founded by a Persian man named Shah Ismail, and it was the first time in centuries that a native Persian grew to rule over Persia. After being enthroned as Shah of Iran, he set out, using gunpowder weapons, to conquer nearby territories, eventually expanding his realm to look like that. He also proclaimed that the official religion of his empire was Shia Islam, part of a trend where rulers employ religion in order to control their subjects, but we'll talk more about that in a future episode. Shia Islam dates back to the initial controversy over inheritance of the leadership of the Ummah following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Why it matters here is that their neighbors, the Ottomans, were strictly Sunni. Since both branches of Islam declare the other heretics and infidels, it made for border squabbles and shady dealings. This became particularly problematic when pro-Shia forces would sneak over the border into Ottoman lands and stir up rebellions against the Ottomans. This eventually led to war between the two empires and a continuing state of distrust between the Sunni states of the Middle East and the Shia nation of Iran today. A final Islamic empire to discuss is the Mughal Empire of India. In 1525, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, named Babur, decided that he was not happy ruling the Central Asian kingdoms of Fergana, Samarkand, and Kabul, Afghanistan, and that he would invade India. He began trading with the Ottomans and acquiring gunpowder weapons like firearms and cannons, and set his sights on the remnants of the Delhi Sultanate in northern India. At the First Battle of Panipat and the following battles in Delhi and Agra, Babur's cannons and guns overwhelmed the elephants of the Sultan of Lodi and set him and his sons and grandsons up as emperors of a new Mughal dynasty. His grandson, Akbar, would be their greatest emperor, a man who only slept 3 hours a night and tried to bridge the widening gap between his Muslim and Hindu subjects. Despite this, however, Akbar would also use mines and siege cannons to destroy an uprising of Hindu nobles, or Rajputs, at the siege of Chittagong in 1568. Finally, we'll make our way to China. After the collapse of the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368, China was ruled by a native Chinese dynasty known as the Ming. However, by the early 1600s, a collapse in the silver-based economy and peasant rebellions left them ripe for picking by a group of nomadic pastoralists from Manchuria known as the Manchu. Following the suicide of the last Ming emperor, his major generals joined forces with the invading Manchu, and together they formed the Qing dynasty, which would be China's last dynasty and their second foreign dynasty. When one of their most famous emperors, the Kangxi Emperor, gained the throne, it was clear that it would take a massive gunpowder-based army to put down the still simmering pro-Ming rebellions and expand China back to its former glory. Qing China's greatest expansion, however, came about 80 years later, during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. Starting with the defeat of the Dzungar Mongols, emperors like Qianlong could unify the peoples of Asia under the universal rule of the Chinese. Employing, you guessed it, gunpowder weapons and a more technically superior military, the Qing armies expanded into Central Asia, disrupting the traditional centrality of Central Asia and turning it instead to the backwater frontier of the Chinese Empire. While these empires ranged in their longevity, the idea of empire would outlive them. It would shift and change with the times and technology until finally, after World War II, the entire idea would be discredited. Empires, however, are inherently multi-ethnic and multiracial. People in an empire have to learn how to live with people who don't identify like they do. Nation states like we have now behave differently, relying on belief and buy-in to maintain control. Which way is better? Well, I guess it depends. As usual, it's definitely complicated.